All right. Well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Peter Forcelli. Give you a little bit of background on Pete. He is the recently retired deputy assistant director of the Department of Justice's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. During the conversation today, we're going to refer to that group as the ATF. Prior to the ATF, Peter was a New York City police detective working in homicide, and Peter was also a first responder and survivor of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, a day that I will never forget on the World Trade Center. Um, Peter is also the author of the terrific book, The Deadly Path, where he tells the story of becoming a whistleblower for the highly publicized Operation Fast and Furious scandal. And as Peter and I were talking about before, the most shocking thing of this book is that it's actually true. I would highly recommend people take a read of this book because it is a eye-opening account of a very highly publicized operation in the United States, and it also, which we're going to talk a little bit about, shed some light on the life of a whistleblower, which is not very fun, as Pete is going to explain, especially if you're a whistleblower within the federal government. Not a good experience to go through. But maybe Pete, to start, just talk a little bit about your days with the NYPD. How did you get involved with law enforcement, and where did things start with you at the New York Police Department?
For sure. And Scott, thanks for having me. So yeah, I started with the NYPD. I was 20 years old. I took the test to become a New York City cop when I was 16 and a half years old. Back then you could take the
Wow.
test. You just had to be 16 and a half to take it. So I took it and passed it, but I was too young to actually join. So what happened was, they kept me on the list. I did some random work, did carpentry work and whatnot as a kid, still a teenager. And then at age 20, I started with the New York City Housing Authority Police Department because there were three different departments back then. Giuliani merged them in 1995 when he was mayor. So the what happened was I started as a New York City Housing Authority cop, walked the beat, did foot patrol, just like folks do back in the TV shows, where you weren't even really in a car. You walked the beat in the projects.
Wow.
After a few years of doing that, I did wind up getting a seat in the sector car, which I had to earn. I handled 911 jobs and did all the things that you see cops do on TV. Um, Finally was asked to go into the detective bureau, still in the housing police. Great job, worked with some real old timers. They took the time to teach me the job, which was a gift I could never really repay back. And then Giuliani came in and merged the departments together. So I wound up still being a detective in precincts in the Bronx, doing general detective work. And then a couple of years into that, I was asked to go into the Bronx Homicide Task Force. Back when New York finally admitted, because I think they knew they had a gang problem, but they were resistant to admit it to the public. And then finally, they decided that they would admit it. So I wound up going into the Bronx Homicide Task Force, working with federal agencies. So we were doing racketeering cases and continuing criminal enterprise cases to go after some pretty vicious gangs in Bronx County. And it was there that I got my taste of the federal court system, which was way more effective at putting down gangs than the state court system, which was kind of a revolving door of justice. And, in working there, I worked a lot with DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, worked with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and I worked with the FBI. And I found the ATF folks were the most like cops in that they just, organizational pride wasn't the thing. It was more about getting the job done and going after some violent people. So about 5 years into my time with the Bronx Homicide Task Force, I jumped ship and switched over to ATF. I was an agent in New York for about 6 years, then a supervisor in Phoenix for 5. Did a little stint in headquarters. Went up to Canada for 2 years. Came back to the U.S. in headquarters where I was the head of leadership and professional development division. Then went down to Florida. I was down there for a few years as the number 2 of the office, and then eventually the agent in charge of the Miami office. And then wrapped up my time in headquarters as the head of training for the entire organization. But reality is I started, my time in law enforcement because I just was always fascinated by police shows as a kid. And the limited exposure I had to actual police was always very positive. But I came from a family of construction workers. Like my father was a crane operator. His father and all his father's brothers were all heavy equipment operators, crane operators and whatnot. And I think that's what they wanted me to do. but it wasn't something that was in my heart. And I did it. I tried my hand at carpentry and wasn't very good at it. So policing was just a natural fit for me, I think.
And why the homicide division, Pete? Was that one that you kind of like that would seem to be like some pretty heavy stuff that you would see in the homicide division. Was there a reason why you kind of trended towards that? Did you have an interest in that? What sort of got you into homicide?
Well, the truth is, as a detective in the NYPD, the pinnacles of your career were always looked at as like a homicide detective or the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which prior to 9/11 was very, very small, or some of the robbery task forces. And it's because you're going after really violent people. In reality, having done investigations of all different sorts, you realize that a homicide case is often no harder to solve sometimes than a theft from a mailbox case. But there was some prestige that went along with working homicide cases. And I did find some value in speaking for the dead. I mean, that's you take somebody's
Yep.
life, they leave people behind. There was a real sense of pride in being able to help bring justice to the families when we could. So, I mean, that's pretty impactful. And then look, I worked with some folks who did sex crime investigations, and I'll tell you, I found that to be impactful work and stuff that I really don't know that I would have handled well. I mean, what worse thing can you do to some poor woman or a child than commit a rape? So I give a lot of credit to the folks that do that kind of work day in and day out, because it takes a lot out of you. A homicide does as well, but it's different. Again, you're speaking for the dead. You don't have to look the victim in the eye. The victim's gone. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's how I felt about it.
That makes perfect sense. No, that makes perfect sense. I'd be keen to know because we're going to talk a little bit about this when you move to Phoenix. But if we just start with the NYPD, um, when you started, you mentioned that it was kind of TV shows that got you at least interested in the NYPD, or at least the police work. Just interested to know, when you started there, was it what you had expected? Because we'll talk a little bit about Phoenix later on, in that it wasn't what you expected. But I'm just wondering to know, at the NYPD, when you started and you started, doing work and getting into things, was it what you expected, or was it completely different than what we would see on TV?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's different than if you watch the action shows. I mean, and every
Yeah,
homicide gets solved in an hour,
yeah,
unless it's a two episode, to be continued, and you got 2 hours. I mean, some homicides never get solved. That's just the
yeah.
reality. But no, it wasn't like what I saw on TV. And, it's a lot of paperwork and a lot of boredom. So I'd say maybe 10% excitement. But it's noble work, and I work with some great people. But I mean, for folks who watch TV who wanted to get a real flavor for what policing in New York City was like, I would say, even though the show wasn't based in New York, The Wire, which was based in Baltimore, was spot on
Oh,
accurate
really?
about policing. Oh my God, yeah, it was spot on
I love
accurate
The
about
Wire. I
policing.
I
Yeah,
love The Wire. Yeah.
so that was accurate. Law and Order wasn't bad. The first show, it got a little weird with some of the spinoffs, I think. NYPD Blue wasn't that far off. And candidly, Barney Miller, which was an old comedy from the 1970s, I think it's still on some of the older channels that show TV shows from back in the day. It really captured like the banter that happens in the precinct detective squads pretty accurately. Because I mean, when you're in there, you're messing with each other. There's a camaraderie that exists in law enforcement that I think, other than in law enforcement, the military, or maybe in some really high speed trauma centers where doctors really are like crushing it, it's hard to replicate, because that kind of pressure most people aren't under. You know what I mean? So
Oh,
yeah, I found Barney Miller to be actually a pretty good show at depicting the life of an NYPD cop, in the squad room, at least the banter that happens in the squad room.
and what would you say from The Wire? Like, what? Like, I love that The Wire was a fantastic show, and it's a complicated show. Like, again, there's a lot of push and pull that's going on there, and like, the pressure on numbers, and how do you deal with violence? It's not like a easy answer to just say, you know what, I'm going to put more cops on the street, and that's what's going to deal with it. It is a very complicated issue. It involves working with politicians, and The Wire did a really good job of trying to work that out. Just came from your perspective, and it's based in Baltimore, so it's obviously a different jurisdiction. But what was, from your perspective, what were some of the similarities with The Wire that you would point out?
Almost everything. In fact, I used to get frustrated with it back in the day, because when I watched The Wire, I was still doing that sort of work. It's almost like they were giving away too much of the trade
Oh,
secrets.
wow.
I mean, the wiretaps, how it works, going out there flipping defendants, which means you're arresting them, you're building rapport with them, having them go back out there and work for you, or just having them unload everything they know, and then you got to go out and corroborate it. Some of the cultural dynamics, because, working those sorts of cases, I got to know the defendants. You sit in a room with them sometimes. There were some that I've interviewed for hundreds of hours. So you get to know a little bit about them, their upbringing. So, I mean, The Wire really just captured not just the policing, but like the culture of an inner city on the eastern coast of the United States. Just a lot of dynamics. I mean, some of the seasons I don't think were so great. Like there was the one season that focused on the waterfront. I don't know that was the most accurate. But I mean, just how they portrayed police, and the fact that some of the cops are flawed people. I work with some amazing people. I work with some who had problems, drinking, whatever, weren't corrupt. And the other thing is that I'd say is, look, the only people who hate a bad cop, no one does it more than a good cop. So, I mean, in some worlds, people think that police tolerate bad police. I haven't seen that. And have I seen a couple of cops who I really didn't respect because they weren't maybe, very respectful to the community, or they were out for themselves? Sure. But those folks get weeded out and kind of ostracized by the good cops who band together because, I mean, you rely on each other for survival. So, I mean, that 1-2% of police that mess up, unfortunately give a bad name for others, but I would argue it's unjustifiable. And of late, when you hear about all this defund and everything, I mean, that's all you hear about sometimes. It's really unfortunate because most cops are just good people who want to do a good job. And I think The Wire captured that as well. I mean, some of those characters were noble in their intent, but they were flawed characters. So, I mean, that show was just incredibly well written and very well executed. But you want to see what it's like to be a cop in, like, an urban area on the eastern coast of the United States, watch The Wire.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I think if you looked at any job, there's going to be a 1 or 2% of the staff that are not up to are not meeting expectations for whatever reason. The difference with police officers is that the work that you do is so critical that it just sticks out more. You know what I mean? And it becomes it. And it's just because, again, the work that you're doing is so high profile compared to, say, my world in accounting. It's the other end of the spectrum. The 1 or 2% will never be mentioned anywhere. But the 1 or 2% in the police force, because of the nature of the work that you guys do, it's a totally different situation. The stakes and the pressure is just so much higher compared to so many other. Well,
some of the mistakes can't be undone is the problem. I mean, mistakes when you're talking about human life or somebody's freedom, those mistakes are horrible. But I mean, again, humans are human, and I mean, we're fallible. And I think anybody who expects perfection out of law enforcement is always going to be disappointed because the law enforcement organizations are staffed by people.
Well, look, and if there's one thing that all humans share in common is that we all make mistakes. Like every single human, and if you're making decisions and having to, again, make decisions real time, you are going to make mistakes. That's just how it is. That's part of being human. It's one of the very few things that probably all humans share in common. It's just in some jobs, like you say, the stakes are just so high. It's we talked to one person on the program, like for some police officers, they maybe pull their gun out of their holster one time in their whole career. Or 2 times in their whole career. You can imagine, your whole career comes down to that 1 or 2 times that actually happens. It's a lot of pressure, and for a singular, and unless you're in that situation, I don't know how you can comment on that. You know what I mean? Of being, because that's a lot. That's certainly a lot to deal with. So, what I want to talk a little bit about, Pete, is the events of 9/11. Because Peter was one of the many heroic first responders of 9/11 who helped save countless lives. And as I had mentioned, Pete, earlier, is that, we don't have a podcast that's got millions of listeners. That's not us, but we do have a global audience. And there are people listening from all over the world. And as we get into 9/11 and talk a little bit about of the role that Pete played, I want to just give some perspective on the events of 9/11. It's certainly a day that I'll never forget. But for those that believe that this was an attack on U.S. citizens, you'd be half right in that obviously the U.S. lost the U.S. citizens made up most of the folks that lost their lives on 9/11. But there was over 90 countries where they had lost citizens in the attacks on 9/11. You take those World Trade Centers, there was a reason why those buildings were called the World Trade Centers, is because you had many people from many different nationalities. And I think what would be helpful for people to get an understanding is, it's going to take me about 60 seconds here, but I'm going to rhyme off the countries of the folks who lost citizens. It's going to take about 60 seconds, but I think it's going to make a point here. So I'm going to rhyme them off. Here's the list. This is a report that's came out from the U.S. Department of State. I hope it's accurate. I think it is. It's consistent with some of the other materials that I've read. But here's a list of the countries: Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, Armenia, Australia, Austria, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Barbados, Belarus, Belgium, Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, China, Colombia, Cote d'Ivoire, Cuba, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Dominica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Egypt, El Salvador, Ethiopia, France, the Gambia, Georgia, Germany, Ghana, Greece, Grenada, Guatemala, Guyana, Haiti, Honduras, India, Indonesia, Iran, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Jamaica, Japan, Jordan, Pakistan, Kenya, Lebanon, Liberia, Lithuania, Malaysia, Mali, Mexico, Moldova, Netherlands, New Zealand, Nigeria, Pakistan, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Russia, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, South Africa, South Korea, Spain, Sri Lanka, Sweden, Switzerland, Syria, Thailand, Togo, Trinidad and Tobago, Turkey, United Kingdom, Ukraine, Uruguay, Uzbekistan, Venezuela, Vietnam, Yemen, the countries of the former Yugoslavia, and Zambia. Those are the countries, in addition to the United States, who lost citizens as a result of those attacks on 9/11. And if you heard your country listed there, even if you didn't, you owe a big thank you to Peter Forcelli, because Peter was one of the many first responders who were first on the scene, trying to save as many lives as they possibly can. So here's how the events unfolded. Again, September 11th, 2001 is a day I'll never forget. And I'm guessing anybody around the same age as me is probably in the same boat. But on the morning of September 11, 2001, two airplanes hit each of the Twin Towers, and shortly thereafter, those World Trade Centers collapsed. And downtown New York City turned into absolute chaos in Manhattan. Now, if it was me, I'd be getting out of Dodge, getting out of New York City as quickly as possible. I'd be packing my laptop in my bag, getting out of Manhattan ASAP. That would be my game plan. However, Peter was working for the NYPD at the time. Peter received a call that help was needed in downtown Manhattan. And what did he do is he turned his car right around and basically headed straight into the eye of the hurricane in order to help all those people in need on that particular day. So Peter, certainly on behalf of Canada, I think we have 5 or 6 memorials set up across the country remembering those who perished in as a result of those attacks. But we all owe you a big thank you for being one of the many first responders who played a critical role in saving many lives on that day. And as we're going to find out too, the impacts on those first responders. Obviously, there was a lot of firefighters who lost their lives on that particular day. But what you shouldn't lose sight of is that I think as it stands now, as reading an article, there's actually been just as many first responders who have lost their life subsequent to 9/11 as a result of, whether it be lung cancer or whatever it may be, who the number of people who have lost their lives has actually mirrored the number of firefighters who lost their lives on the day one of the attack. So in any event, Peter, we owe you a big thank you for all of those, all of your efforts. But maybe just give us some perspective. How did that morning start for you? How did that day start? And maybe just good perspective on how that day played out.
Sure. Well, a couple things. Number one is nobody owes me a thanks. I did what I was actually paid to do. I'll tell you who I think are heroes. I mean, obviously all the cops and firemen are heroes, but there were people in those buildings who were not first responders. There were people in those buildings who were physically capable of leaving. And, at some point they encountered a colleague who couldn't leave because they were either paralyzed with fear or handicapped, and the elevators shut down. The elevator banks blew up basically because of the fire. And they stayed behind. They could have left, but they stayed behind, and they lost their lives because they were just looking out for their fellow man. I mean, that's heroism. And then there are some folks who, from a variety of countries, showed up for work every day just to feed their families. I like to think of them as heroes too. They didn't come to work to sacrifice their lives. So, yeah, 343 New York City firemen perished, 23 New York City police officers, and 37 Port Authority police officers. And I had actually just started with ATF prior to this, so I wasn't with the NYPD anymore. But our offices were in the 6 World Trade Center, which wasn't one of the 2 towers. It was a building that was adjacent to the North Tower. So, but that morning, I got there shortly after the first plane hit. Got out of my car, did what I could do, which was basically to keep people moving to get them out of there so ambulances and fire trucks could get in and additional police officers. And then at some point, got to realize that, you needed to go up to the mezzanine because the towers didn't sit at ground level. They sat on a mezzanine. And, did the same thing, kept people moving. While I was up there, I remember seeing some young female EMT tending to a patient who was on the ground. When the second plane hit, I was standing near the South Tower, and I remember looking to my left and seeing her on the ground, and I just literally watched the color leave her face, and very clear to me that she was mortally wounded. And while still there by the South Tower, I remember continuing to look north, just trying to figure out what can I do, because it was just such a big scene that you just filled in whatever hole you could right there at that time. There was no planning. There was no, we'd never practiced something like that. And I remember seeing, for the first time in my career, someone jump from a very high place on a building. And as a cop, you'd get called occasionally to jumpers, we called them. And usually a person had jumped, so it was a crime scene. Or someone was sitting on a windowsill or something like that, waiting, or a roof ledge, waiting to be talked off, because it was more of a cry for help than an effort to really kill themselves or hurt themselves. So it was the first time I saw someone jump. And I remember even now, like I could still hear the sound of how it sounded when they hit the ground. I mean, you literally braced yourself like you were about to get punched in the face when you would see them falling, because it's not something you wanted to hear. And then shortly after, I saw a second person jump, and rather than hit the ground, they hit like one of those overhangs that you would stand under to be out of the rain, which underneath that particular overhang, they were triaging patients, them being firemen and EMS workers. So at this point, I decided this was not a safe place to be, so I made my way back beyond the North Tower, back down these steps. They were called the Vesey Street steps, and back down to ground level. And that's when I got stopped by one of my bosses, who had informed me that most of the people that we worked with had not shown up. When there's a fire drill, you're supposed to show up at a place where they can count all the heads to make sure everybody got out. Well, most people didn't show up there. So I was sent back into the site. And I remember walking south on the street that was on the east side of the World Trade Center site, called Church Street, still Church Street. And I saw one of the police officers I had worked with at the 47th precinct. He was a detective, actually, on his knees, crying. His wife was unaccounted for in one of the 2 buildings. And I gave him a few words of comfort that I could, which wasn't much, just saying, hey, I'm sure she'll be okay, which I didn't know, frankly. But I still had to go and look for my colleagues. So, which I felt horrible about. Here's a guy who was suffering, and I had to leave him behind to go look for my ATF colleagues. And I got a little bit further south, still on Church Street, when I got stopped by 2 ATF agents that I did recognize, Sal and Jason. Jason was a younger guy. He got hired a little bit before I did. He's a bit younger than me, though. And then Sal, who was an older guy, about ready to retire. And I remember as I was standing there, I looked back across the street at the Trade Center site, and I saw a bunch of NYPD cops walking into the site from the emergency service unit. And I had tried out for the emergency service unit, but didn't pay it. I got weeded out for fear of heights. And but I recognized 3 of them. John Coughlin, who was a sergeant when I was a brand new cop, who I worked with. Great guy, big guy. He was a part of that pipe and drum band, so I think he played the bagpipes. Vinny Dans, who I went through the academy with, little short guy, former ex-Marine, always with a smile on his face. We went through field training together, too. And then Walter Weaver, who was a much younger cop, who, when I was a detective in the 47 precinct, Walter was a cop there, and he loved to talk about watches. He loved watches, Omegas, Breitlings, Rolexes. And I liked watches back then, too. So, but I remember staring at those guys as they were walking into the site, not really paying attention to my ATF colleagues who were to my left, when all of a sudden Jason Zamoloff grabbed my left shoulder, like with force, like with tremendous force, and just yelled one word, which was run. And I remember looking up, and if you ever see the footage of the South Tower falling, it looks, from where we were standing, it looked like the building was falling like a domino towards the East River. But what happened is the building canted at the top, and then it collapsed downward. But from where I was standing at that moment, it looked like it was toppling like a domino. So I just ran directly north, which is where I came from. and I got hit squarely between the shoulder blades with something, and I don't know what it was. And it didn't hurt me per se, but it got my attention. Like it probably bounced off the ground. And I remember thinking to myself, I need to get cover. So you did what training makes you do. I saw some police cars nearby and a fire truck. And I said, my fat ass isn't going to fit under those police cars, but I can fit under that fire truck. So I rolled down onto my hands and knees and then went under the fire truck. And I remember being there for just a few seconds, and the ground was shaking. And all of a sudden, I got hit in the face with that dust cloud. And that cloud, because of the weight of the buildings, it had like some force behind it, but it was also very gritty. So I remember being under the truck. I probably was only under there for maybe under a minute. Felt like I was under there for a lot longer. And I remember my eyes, like blinking my eyes, felt like somebody was sandpapering my eyeballs. And the air got really thick. And I said to myself, hey, stupid, you're going to die here. So I rolled out from under the fire truck and just continued to run north. I remember my head was facing north when I went under the truck. I continued to go in that direction. You couldn't see really anything. And I remember as I got about a block or two up, I remember somebody screaming, over here, over here. And it didn't sound like somebody who was like in need of help. It sounded like somebody who was offering help, which is weird. I don't know how my brain processed that. So I ran towards that voice, and a person got, as soon as I got through the door threshold, the person grabbed me by my shirt and brought me to a water fountain that you would normally drink out of. And I washed out my face and eyes. And I remember the chief of NYPD detectives was in the back room, and I had since left the NYPD, like I said. And I remember him coming out and asking what happened. And I had to tell him, and everybody there, the South Tower just fell. And he looked at me in like complete disbelief. And he goes, what? I said, Chief, the South Tower just fell. And I watched this guy who had been around and just seen a lot of things over his career, his just shoulders slumped forward, turned around and walked back into the room that he came out of. And then eventually people tried to push past me, and I was telling them, don't go out there, because if you can't breathe, you're going to go down. You can't help anybody. Some folks didn't listen. I waited for the dust to settle a little bit, went out and tried to see if we could help anybody. But for the most part, people either died or were able to be on their own 2 feet walking out, like they were crushed or okay. So a short time later, I got a call from my boss. One of our colleagues was trapped in a car. Her name was Kara. So my thoughts were, she's pinned in the car like you would see in a car accident. She needs to be cut out. I had no tools. Well, we went and found her. And what happened was she was trapped in the car because she was pregnant. And she was physically afraid to get out of the car and breathe that disgusting air. So myself and another agent named Bill Sheldon, who since died of 9/11 related cancer, we got Kara out of the car and we brought her to a hospital nearby called the Beekman Downtown Hospital. And I remember as I was walking down the stairs towards the hospital, like you had to walk under the Brooklyn Bridge overpass to get there. I remember being able to see out front a bunch of gurneys and people in lab coats and people in scrubs and paramedics and EMTs out there waiting for patients. And I remember just empty gurneys. So when we got Kara there, they took care of her right away, which was great for Kara. But there were people who were like, hey, where is everybody? Like they were frustrated because they were wanting to help and there was nobody for them to help. And I kind of knew how they felt, because that's how I felt when the South Tower fell and we went out to try to help people. And it's like, there's either people were walking, they were ambulatory and they were getting away on their own 2 feet, or they perished in the buildings. So anyway, after we dropped Kara off, I made my way back to the site. On my way back, I got stopped a couple times because as people were running, they dropped backpacks. So now NYPD's bomb squad wasn't sure if this was people who dropped secondary explosive devices, so they were rendering them safe so you couldn't run down those blocks. It made it real complicated, but eventually I got back to the site, met with another one of my bosses, a guy named Bill McMahon. That's when the North Tower fell. I wasn't that close to the North Tower, so we just a few blocks away. But same thing, because the cloud was so big, we ducked into a grocery store, waited for the cloud to settle, went back out, tried to help who we could help. Same thing, we just kept people moving, but it wasn't like we rescued anybody per se. We tried, but you either were walking or you were buried in those buildings. So I spent 3 days, well, actually 2 nights on scene, never went home. Took a nap at one point at one of our offices in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which was just across the river. But it was a rough couple of days, and finally made it home on the morning of day number 3. And that's when my wife told me that not only did Vinnie Danz, John Coughlin, and Walter Weaver die, 3 of my other friends who were NYPD cops also perished, as did Danny Harlan, who was a cop I worked with that became a fireman. Luckily, the 2 ATF agents I mentioned survived. They ran in a different direction, but I spent the first day at my time there, thinking that they died because I barely got out myself. So it was a rough time. And then the months that followed, dealt with like survivor's guilt because I wondered, some of these people I loved, and I'm like, why are they gone and I'm still here? So that
Yeah.
was a tough thing to get my head around for a while, but I'm here.
Well, and that dust cloud had quite a negative impact down the road on a number of individuals, including yourself. Right? Like maybe just talk a little bit about that. There were the people who perished, obviously, on day one, but that dust cloud, the tail on that was a lot longer, and maybe it's not as well reported in terms of the number of people that have actually suffered as a result and died
Yeah.
because of that dust cloud. Maybe just talk a little bit about that, on the impact that had on many lives, including your own.
Sure, sure. Well, I mentioned I lost 7 friends on 9/11. I've lost more than 3 times that number since then. People
Wow.
I field trained, for example, Lieutenant
Wow.
Jennifer Meehan. I trained her when she was a rookie cop. She died a couple years ago of brain cancer. Charlie Clark, Steve Paveglio. I mean, I can name names. And every time I log into the law enforcement memorial page, I see another name. So yeah, we're still losing folks. And then myself in 2018, I was up in the Army War College mentoring a class of ATF mid-level supervisors, and coughed up some blood. Went to the one of those local urgent cares, we call them down here, and they found the spot on my lung. Turned out I had lung cancer, so they took out my right lung. 17 lymph nodes with it. Luckily, it didn't spread past the first node they call the sentinel node. So I didn't need to have radiation or chemo, and that was 6 years ago. So I'm now officially, they could say, cancer free. But yeah, I mean, I still every day wonder, will it come back? And I've lost so many friends. I mean, they say that more people have died as a result of 9/11 related illness. That's not just cops and firemen; it's just people in general. Than died on 9/11. So it's something that I think we're going to continue to see. Look, the sad part is that the government told us the air was safe to breathe, and they were lying.
Wow. 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 Yeah. Well, Peter, we definitely owe you a thank you. And not just yourself. Obviously, there was a number of first responders and others who played a critical role in that. That is quite the account of what happened. I can't even picture something like that occurring. To think that two iconic buildings in New York City would fall like that so quickly too, right? These weren't standing around for days. This was hours we're talking about. I'm not even sure if it was hours, but so maybe we'll just try and pivot off of that, because from what I read in the book, this was kind of around the same time that you made a decision to transition from the ATF in New York to the ATF in Arizona, in Phoenix. Maybe just talk a little bit about why did you want to do the change? What was kind of the motivation to kind of move from the ATF and move into a completely new sunny Arizona?
Hmm. Yeah, well, unfortunately, like driving past Ground Zero, because the federal courthouse was not too far from Ground Zero, started to get difficult for me.
Yeah.
I was contending with some survivor's guilt, a little bit of PTSD probably as well at that time, certainly later. But so the only way out of New York, I've learned, was to promote out. So I had put in for transfers before that. I put in for a transfer to Tampa, was denied. Put in for a transfer to Paducah, Kentucky, which I'm sure I probably wouldn't have fit in very well there, was denied. So I put in to promote, which was the easy way to get out of New York State, because New York's so expensive to live. Agents don't generally want to go there, and
Yep.
the ones who were there are kind of stuck there. So I put in for positions in Jacksonville, Savannah, Georgia, Dallas, Texas, and Phoenix. And part
Okay.
of it was to get away from the stress of being in New York. So I got picked for Phoenix. Little did I know that I would find myself in a situation there that was a lot more stressful than 9/11 in many ways.
Yeah. So before we go too far at into the time of the ATF at Phoenix, what I think would be helpful for the group is to educate people on firearms in the United States, how the ATF, kind of is responsible or plays a part in trying to manage the distribution of firearms. But to start to maybe as a starting point, Pete, maybe just give some perspective out there to the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms in the United States, and maybe how that's looked upon in the U.S. and then what the ATF's role is in terms of trying to kind of enforce, I guess, to some degree that particular right, and making sure that firearms are closely monitored in the U.S.
Sure. Well, I mean, folks know that the United States, when they signed the Declaration of Independence, it was because they were fighting back from the oppression that they felt at the time from the King of England.
Yep.
So part of what the country was founded on was, I guess, rebellion and the ability to defend itself from England and from oppressive governments. So the Second Amendment was written into the Constitution as a way to allow for people to form militias to fight back against oppressors, to include its own government if need be. Kind of a weird thing, I guess, to try to put through your head. How do you fight back against your own government? But I mean, these were people who, and that's what they wrote back in the day. So the Second Amendment obviously is the law of the land in the United States. But there are some restrictions, right? And ATF's job is to regulate the firearms industry. So, I mean, they regulate the industry and they enforce laws that are federal laws in the U.S. that were written under the National Firearms Act, which was written back in the days of Al Capone and, the bootleggers. And then the Gun Control Act of 1968, which is more recent, obviously, and is more geared towards, I guess, in some way, street level crime. And there's a lot of pushback because some folks say there should be no gun laws because of the Second Amendment. So that made the job as an ATF agent very difficult because we had to stay apolitical, right? Or else we run, the risk of being perceived as being some sort of a hatchet for the government. So, and it was challenging because at times, ATF made some mistakes and there were times where people didn't think they were doing enough. And there's a lot of, really strong opinions on both sides. I'll give you some examples. Like after the shooting that happened in Sandy Hook or in Parkland, there were some people who were like, you should arm all the teachers. And then on the other side, there were people who were like, we should ban all guns. And so, I mean, it's very, very difficult to work in the law enforcement world when you have such polarized opinions.
Yep.
But the reality is our job is to enforce the law of the land, and the Second Amendment is part of the Constitution, which we take an oath to. So it's really like walking a tightrope. And it's challenging at times because sometimes the agency is demonized because people think that we should be doing more, whether or far, far less when it comes to enforcing gun laws. So it's challenging. The other thing that makes it challenging is, unlike in some countries that have a national law, and like in Canada, where I worked for a couple of years, the law is the law across all of the provinces. In the United States, you have the federal laws, and then each state has its own set of laws. And some of them are incredibly restrictive, like New York City, Chicago, Washington, D.C., California to some degree. And then some have, very few state laws. Arizona would be one. Another would be, I believe it's New Hampshire or Vermont, has no gun laws. So the federal gun laws are the only gun laws. So it's really complicated, and it certainly makes the job of being an ATF agent difficult. But that's why I think it's so important for them to be kind of indifferent to the gun and focus more on the law. Otherwise, things get complicated and congressional hearings and all kinds of crazy stuff. But that's just what we're situated here with in the United States.
And to try and simplify it, would it be fair to say that, look, the gun laws, effectively what they try and do is make sure that you know exactly who a gun is being sold to. And if that gun is ever used in a crime, there's a serial number on that gun that you guys at the ATF can trace that thing right back to source. Like, is that, if you were to kind of simplify how you're trying to kind of oversee or manage the gun control, is it as simple as that, or is it more complicated than that? Because one of the things that was really surprising to me is the fact that if a gun or some form of arms were used in a crime, that you guys can take that and basically trace it right back, almost like to some pretty. You can almost trace it right back to source, like when it was manufactured, who manufactured, who sold. You can know everything about that gun.
Well, yes and no. Like the way it works is when a gun is traced, it's traced from when it's manufactured to its first point of retail purchase. So like, let's say I'm a gun manufacturer. I make a gun, I send it to you, and then you send it to another dealer, right? Along the way, there are documents that are kept. Now that dealer is required to say who he sold the gun to, because if he's a licensed member of the industry, a dealer. And I found most of them to be incredibly helpful when we did our investigations. But there is also in many states, and again, this is where the state law comes into handy, but under federal law, if I have many, many guns that I've acquired over the years, they're my personal collection, right? So I've acquired them, and now all of a sudden something has changed. I have a baby in the house. I don't want to have guns in the house. Or my wife is anti-gun. She's saying I got to get rid of the firearms or whatever. I'm losing my eyesight. Shooting is no longer pleasurable to me. I want to sell my personal collection. I can do that, and there is no requirement for such documentation. So that makes it a little bit difficult sometimes to trace guns. It also makes it challenging because some folks exploit that to sell guns in black markets. We call them, in the ATF world, unlicensed dealers, right? So again, they're not people who are selling the guns because it's just they're tired of their personal collection. I'm talking specifically about the ones who buy them to get rid of them. They're buying them, they're going to sell them for a profit. That's illegal. For the folks who just like, hey, I've had it for a little while, I don't like it, or I took it to the range and I really hate the way it fires, I'm going to sell it. There's nothing that prevents them from doing that legally in most states. So that's not a crime. So, but yeah, the tracing of guns in commerce is a huge tool that ATF agents use to try to find out where that gun entered into, once it left the industry and made its way into the real world, and then to find out how it got into the hands of criminals. So, I mean, it's not always a direct path. If it was sold to someone some time ago and then they had it for a while and decided to sell it on their own. So, I mean, that's why the laws in the United States, they're meant to protect the individual. It doesn't always make it easy for the investigator.
And then maybe help us understand some of the key terms that you use in your book. What does it mean when you say someone allows you to walk guns, and why would the ATF never allow that to happen? So maybe help us understand that term. What does it mean to walk guns?
Sure. Well, there's 3 ways to walk guns, and the third way I never heard of until Operation Fast and Furious. So it was when I got questioned by congressional investigators, it was hard to describe, that this way, because it was just so against the grain of everything that we did. One would be, let's say that I'm an undercover officer or an undercover ATF agent, and I'm trying to do business with you. I want to look like some sort of a big shot, or I want, hey, if I sell you a gun, maybe you'll sell me drugs. So as in an undercover capacity, I sell you a gun and I allow you to leave with it. So we did things like that all the time, but the way it would work is we would do it in a controlled area. If you're a felon, you want to buy a gun, I want to get you for doing that, or I'm trying to ingratiate myself with you as part of some bigger organization, and I want to arrest you and then flip you and build a bigger case. The way we would do it is we would do it in a controlled environment, and the second you had custody of that gun, you would be jumped by a tactical team or a backup team, and you'd be arrested and charged, and you can cooperate your way out of that situation. A second way would be if we stopped the car, and this happened all the time in Phoenix. And when you read my book, you saw this. We would get word from a licensed gun dealer saying, "Hey, man, there's a suspicious transaction that just happened here," or even aside from that, if we stop a car and you're a felon, you're not allowed to have a gun in the United States if you're a convicted felon. If we decided, well, you know what, let him go with the gun, or in these instances where the dealers would call us with a suspicious transaction, we would stop the car. We would ask the questions. We would get confessions. They were bringing the guns to Mexico or to Mexican mafia members or to Aryan Brotherhood members, which is illegal. They're straw purchasers. If we were to let those guns go, we would have walked them because we had a lawful responsibility to interdict them. The final one, and this was one that was something I only saw in Fast and Furious, is, and again, I mentioned the dealers cooperating with us. The dealers that we dealt with wouldn't sell guns and call us unless we were outside to do an interdiction because they didn't want the guns to fall into the hands of criminals. They didn't want their guns used to shoot some cop or some kid or whatever. So they would make those transactions with the confidence that, hey, the ATF guys are outside. And when I do this, they're going to stop that car and they're going to ask those questions. So they were really working with law enforcement. Well, when Phoenix Group 7 started under Operation Fast and Furious, those dealers did the same thing to them that they did to us. They called them. And they believed that these agents were outside interdicting, when in reality, they were documenting. Did you get that plate? Okay, we know who it is. Okay, who's it come back to? We'll pick up on it later. So they let those guns ride off into the sunset. Now, when you tell the dealer, hey, continue that sale, they're acting on your behalf at that point under the law. They're acting as agents of the government. So in those instances, they walk those guns. But again, I've never seen that until Operation Fast and Furious became a thing. And it was mind blowing, frankly.
Now, you use the term straw buyer. Maybe just give some background on what you mean when you say a straw buyer.
Sure, sure. A straw purchaser is it's nicknamed after a straw man or like a scarecrow. Like it's a person that's supposed to, they're fake in the world of, they're faking to be the person who's buying the gun when in reality they're buying it for somebody else. So in the United States, when you buy a firearm from a dealer, you fill out a form. It's called a Form 4473. And the dealer is required to maintain that form. They're required to share it with ATF if there's an investigation, or if they go out of business, they have to send those records to ATF. On that form, there's a number of questions. Are you a felon? Are you under indictment? Many questions. One of the big questions is, are you buying this gun for yourself? Straw purchasers are saying that they are, when the reality is, before they walked into that gun store or gun show, they made a deal that they're going to hand that gun off to somebody else who would be a trafficker. So straw purchasers are people who buy the gun with the intent when they're buying it, right? As opposed to somebody who bought a gun for themselves and then later on decided they don't want it. Straw purchasers buying the gun knowing I'm going to hand this gun to somebody else as soon as I walk out of the store or within a couple of days. Their intent is to give the gun to somebody else. So they're basically lying on that box on that form. It's felony.
And if they do that, there's some serious consequences, I guess, to if
there should be.
That form. Yeah. So if now we're going to get into the ATF in Phoenix, hopefully we're able to provide a lot of good background on what the role of the ATF is, how, guns work in the US, how there's gun control laws and some of the ways in which, you can kind of get around the rules as well if you want to. As I'd mentioned to you at the outset, Pete, one of the things that really surprised me about the book is that it was all true. Because when you watch a movie or a TV series like a 24, in almost every one of the seasons of 24, there's always somebody on the inside who's kind of the bad guy, and that's half the series is trying to figure out who that person is before they reveal themselves. That's kind of one of the fun parts of watching those series. But in your case, number one, there was more than one. And number two, again, this is a true story. Like this is, and that was one of the most eye-opening things about the book is that it doesn't all just work nice and perfectly. And, everybody on the government is good. And, and then you have the cartels who we know who are not good, are doing bad things. But when you first started at the ATF in Phoenix, when did you first start to get concerned that everything wasn't above board? What kind of threw you off at the outset?
Sure. Well, I think it's important for your listeners to know, before I showed up in Phoenix, I had worked hundreds of gun cases in New York. And most of the cases we would go after the low-hanging fruit, we called it, like the person that was the felon in possession of a firearm. So, we charged them. We would flip them, which, obviously to get them to cooperate with us. And we would build bigger cases. So we would have proffers, which is when you're sitting down with the defendant and their lawyer and you and the prosecutor, and they talk to you, and then you go out and corroborate everything they said. And then there's superseding indictments. So a one defendant case can turn into a huge gang case or a huge home invasion robbery crew case, or you name it. So, I had worked on many, many successful cases. And I only say that because it's relevant when I get out to Phoenix, because it was vastly different. So when I got out to Phoenix, I remember the first weekend I'm out there, my agents got a phone call from a licensed dealer who tipped them off to a guy who walked in with a bag full of money and wanted to buy every AK-47 variant rifle that he had on his shelves. Now, it's important, when I say AK-47, it's not the actual assault rifle that if you pull the trigger, it'll keep shooting. It looks just like it. It has the long magazine. It holds 32 rounds, or you could buy the bigger ones. But you'd have to pull the trigger each time you want to fire a round. So it's not the military version of the weapon. So still, it's, somebody to come in and want to buy a bunch of them is unusual. And the dealer, so it tips us off. So we went out there and we eventually stopped that car. And this is my first big car stop in Phoenix. And we pull the people out of the car. We separate them. We ask them questions. We catch them in a bunch of lies. My agents call the prosecutors and explain everything. Now, I'm brand new there, and I know that in each different U.S. attorney's office, they have different priorities, different policies, different procedures. And so, but anyway, I was kind of shocked when my agents tell me, yeah, the U.S. attorney said, we'll let him go. We can indict it later. Because in New York, it would have been, all right, cuff him up, send him to the county jail, and we'll draw up a paperwork, and you could pick him up tomorrow and take him to the federal judge. So, but again, I'm new, not arrogant enough to think I know everything. It's like, okay. So I would watch that sort of scenario unfold again and again and again, where my agents would do their job, the dealers would call us, they would do their job, we would stop the car, we would ask the questions. I mean, everything that I had done in the past, went to court, won court cases, was happening there. So it wasn't like there was a deficiency anywhere, other than we would be told, let him go, we'll indict it later. Well, what I learned was later was not coming in 90% of those cases. Then there was another case where, because sometimes a straw purchase is an act of deception, like I mentioned, person's lying on that form. The dealers would call us when they saw something suspicious, like a person taking pictures of guns and texting them, because if you know what you want, you're not doing that, right? Or if somebody comes in with somebody else and it seems like the other person is picking the gun, but if somebody comes in there and they're assured in their way and I want this gun and they pass a background check, the dealer doesn't know. So every now and then we would find out about those cases when the guns would wind up at crime scenes. In this one particular instance, the gun wound up at a crime scene in a town called Cananea, which is 42 miles south of the Arizona border. 21 people were killed, 4 of them Mexican police officers. 4 other Mexican police officers were brought into the desert and tortured and left for dead. One of the guns found at the scene was purchased in Arizona less than 48 hours earlier, which is really unusual. That's not one of those situations where somebody brought a gun home, had it for a couple of years, and decided, hey, this isn't for me. Clearly, this was a trafficked firearm. So my agents went out and found the straw purchaser. He confessed. They found the trafficker. He confessed. We brought that case to the federal prosecutor's office. Again, their job is to prosecute the violations of federal law. And they came up with this new policy that went from this point forward that, hey, well, the gun's in Mexico. The body of the crime is in Mexico. We can't prosecute this. Well, as I mentioned, what we were charging people with was lying on the form, right? We had the actual form in hand. And they were the only United States Attorney's Office in the country that took this position that once the gun left the borders of the United States, that they couldn't charge these individuals with trafficking. So all of a sudden now we have this new dynamic where they weren't charging those cases. And there were a lot of those cases, and they almost always involved dead bodies on the other side of the border, which is tragic because these are Mexican human beings. They're not some animal that's out there being hunted. That's, it's questionable. Hey, PETA might be against it, but regular people want to go, hey, we eat it for meat. These are people.
Yeah.
So that was a problem. And then not too far after, we had an informant who was spot on with his information that they decided they didn't like. And it turned out in the end, they didn't like him because they thought he wore too many gold chains and the jury wouldn't relate to him. You could take off gold chains, and a prosecutor can coach a witness on how to be more presentable to a jury. But they declined using any case that had his fingers on it, and that was dozens of cases. So this went on for years. So what happened was we formulated plan Bs. One was to take cases to the county. But in many instances, county prosecutors didn't want second bites at somebody else's apple. And then we actually had to formulate a partnership with the Arizona Attorney General's office, which didn't do gun cases up until that point. But they recognized that what we were dealing with was in many ways life and death. And they're like, well, we don't normally do that, but we'll fill this void. I met with them one day. They started working with us that evening. That's how important it was. But yet the federal prosecutors there just always found the reason, or like I said, 90% of the time found a reason to punt and to not take the case. So anyway, this happened for years. So anyway, in 2009, late 2009, my group's focus changed. We became a home invasion group, and that's kind of the work I did in New York with gun-related home invasion robberies. And it was because Phoenix had become the capital in the United States of home invasions and kidnappings because of the cartel stuff that was happening in Mexico. So a new group was stood up called Phoenix Group 7. So we didn't know what was happening in that group. They didn't sit with us. They sat at an off-site location. But we would hear numbers, in this case, 600 guns. At first, we're like, hey, are you guys interviewing those straw purchasers? You stopping cars? Well, no, we're doing something different. So a while passes, and something happens. A Border Patrol agent named Brian Terry, who was patrolling the Arizona-Mexico border looking for cartel bandits, because there's no honor among thieves. Those folks rob each other, right? Rival cartels rob each other of drugs that are coming across the border so that they could sell them in the United States. And Brian Terry gets killed with a firearm that was smuggled as part of a case that was called Jacob Chambers and others, et al. Now, it turns out the nickname of that case was Operation Fast and Furious. So now we start to hear about what was happening in that group, whereas the dealers who were calling us also start calling us saying, hey, man, like, what the hell's going on with this case? Because all of a sudden our guns are getting traced, right? So when we seized the guns coming out of the gun store, there's no need to trace it. We knew exactly where they're coming from. So we start to talk to these dealers, and they're explaining to us, like, we called them just like we used to call you guys, but why are our guns turning up in Mexico? Well, as it turns out, a lot of those dealers prior to Brian Terry's death were like, hey, man, we don't want to keep selling because our guns are getting traced. And we didn't know this in my group. So the U.S. Attorney's Office, federal prosecutors, and ATF command staff from Phoenix met with these dealers who didn't want to sell guns to suspected straw purchasers anymore and told them to keep doing it. So anyway, an agent in that group named John Dodson, again, he knew what was happening in that group because he was in that group. They were located at a different site than us. Eventually reached out to Senator Chuck Grassley's office and blew the whistle and said that ATF was walking guns. So the response was the United States Attorney's Office, the Attorney General, Eric Holder, the administration, ATF director, they all said John Dodson's a liar and ATF never walks guns. As time would go on and folks in that group started to talk, the water cooler talk, it was very apparent that that's exactly what they did. So at another meeting, I'm sitting there, and the head of the Phoenix ATF office, my ultimate boss in Phoenix, told us, hey, the U.S. Attorney's Office is really pissed at John Dodson for contacting Grassley's office. I'd steer clear of him. Don't be surprised if he finds himself indicted. And at this point, I say to myself, wait a minute. We had all of these firearms traffickers that we recommended for prosecution that they wouldn't prosecute. They wouldn't touch it. And now all of a sudden, there's discussions that they might indict John Dodson, who I didn't know. I never met John. At least I don't think I met him, unless maybe we had shot on the range together at the same day, when the rest of the division shot. But I don't believe I ever had a conversation with him. But the thought that they would indict him when so many firearms traffickers got a pass was a bridge too far for me.
Indict him for what? What was his crime?
I didn't know at the time, to be honest with you, because all I heard was what Bill said. What I later found out, and didn't find out till literally the day after I testified, was that John was engaged in an undercover deal where he actually let 6 guns walk. The intention was to retrieve them later. He didn't. It was bad tactics. It wasn't necessarily as egregious as what the folks did with the Fast and Furious case, where their plan was, let him go to Mexico. We can put pinpoints on a map, and if it's cartel-related shootings, it'll help build this bigger case. John's intention was eventually to go get those guns. He didn't. And that's not how we operated either, but it certainly wasn't anywhere near as egregious as what was happening. And look, he showed honor in at least reaching out and blowing the whistle on Operation Fast and Furious. But at the time, I didn't know why they were talking about indicting him. The fact that they even mentioned it, though, to me was just, it was incredulous. Like, wait a minute. Because, look, there were a lot of firearms traffickers that we referred for prosecution. In a lot of those cases, where the guns were straw purchased without the dealer's knowledge and they were recovered in Mexico, there were bodies, in some instances, a lot of bodies, like Cananea, for example, tied to those guns. So again, the fact that they would even mention possibly indicting John, and I didn't know why, but it didn't matter at that point to me, led to me going home that night, talking to my wife and saying, hey, look, they're talking about indicting this guy, John Dodson. He's in the other group. I find it unconscionable. I'm thinking of reaching out to Grassley's office to explain what's been going on here for the past 3 years. And my wife said, well, if you don't, you're not the guy I married. So lo and behold, the next day, I explained to them what was happening, saying, hey, listen, I know you're being told that John Dodson's lying and that ATF never walks guns. I'm here to tell you he's not a liar. And if you subpoena me, I'll tell you everything you need to know. And eventually they did. And I did. And I also discussed a case against the guy who was trafficking in grenades that the same prosecutor wouldn't prosecute. So, I mean, it was just mind blowing what was happening in Phoenix at that time. But, and it really abandoned the basic principles of what ATF does everywhere else in the country. I mean, that's what made it so insulting, is it wasn't rocket science. This was simple stuff that they just abandoned, through laziness, incompetence, and probably a number of other things.
Do you think there was a view that, look, there's a greater good here? Is that maybe we will let these guns walk, and then we will make some bigger play with some bigger arrests and take down the whole, you go back to these movies. Am I going to take down the one person, or am I going to take down the group of 100? If I let that one person walk, let him go back to his group of 100 and then take down the whole one. Like, do you think there was a thought that could actually work? or was just that was just not part of the
Well,
because you mentioned as well, Peter, about home invasions. Like you would have thought that who knows, are those guns ending up in home invasions? Like I would have thought people would be terrified of something like that. But do you think there was a thought that there's a greater good if you let those guns walk away?
yeah, a couple things. One, that's why we never let guns walk, is because you never knew, would they be pointed at some kid or some old lady or
Yeah.
some cop. Guns in the hands of criminals are a dangerous thing. Initially we didn't hear what was happening in that group. And then eventually there was some talk about them passing this thing called Demand Letter 3, which required dealers to report more than one rifle sale on border states, the ATF, which didn't exist before Fast and Furious. But I had conversations with some of the folks that were directly involved in Fast and Furious after, I stepped forward. One of the case agents on the case, Hope McAllister, worked for me. So, I mean, we were friends. This wasn't like a personal thing. This was something that we should have done. So I even asked, and, what I was told was that they believed that if they took all of this the trace information and pinpointed it to enough cartel activity, that they would eventually be able to put a dent in a cartel-related firearms trafficking network, right? But to me, it made absolutely no sense because, and I hope should have known this, the prosecutors that were involved in this huge plan, right, were the people that we went to for years with cases who always said no, always came up with a reason no. So again, think about this for a second. For many, many cases, once the gun made its way to Mexico, the corpus delicti ruling, right? This was their ruling. Body of the crime is in Mexico, no case. Well, now all of a sudden, the idea is to let the guns go to Mexico. I mean, it made no sense to me whatsoever. The other thing is, like, the Drug Enforcement Administration had a robust network of people in Mexico. They had intelligence assets down there. They had very strong laws. The firearms trafficking laws didn't exist back then. It was merely straw purchasing and then, engaged in the business without a license. There was no firearms trafficking statute, but there was a drug trafficking statute, and it carried a ton of time. And they would extradite people for violating that from other countries. The thought of them extraditing people from Mexico for violating straw purchasing laws was unconscionable. It wasn't going to happen. So, I mean, it really made no sense from a common sense standpoint as to how they thought they would do this. But the concept of doing it with these same prosecutors who weren't doing their job with basic cases, it's like, it would almost be like taking a kid who likes to watch football on TV, who never played a football game, and asking him to come in and quarterback the Super Bowl. There was no way that I saw that this ever could have worked. And look, once the whistle got blown and people from, Congress and from other parts of government, many of whom were lawyers themselves, saw this, they agreed. It's like, what were you thinking? I mean, and then again, there was a Border Patrol agent who, by all accounts, Brian Terry was his name, heroic, former Marine. Not only was he a Border Patrol agent, he was a member of their elite tactical team, which I don't know if you followed the school shootings that we've had here in the United States. There was that one in Uvalde, Texas, where the cops were out front and they didn't go in.
Yep.
Well, it was one of those Border Patrol BORTAC guys that went past an entire cadre of cops alone and took out that threat. Wow. Well, Brian Terry was part of that team. He was like among the most elite law enforcement tactical folks in the nation, and he gave his life in the line of duty. And to me, just like I said, it was a catastrophic failure of leadership, and it made no sense as to why it happened. And look, I've had over 12 years to think back on what were they thinking? Like, how could it have worked? And I still can't think of what they actually thought they were going to accomplish.
So, and take us, you mentioned you sat down with your wife the night before. Take us into that conversation, Pete. Like, how did you think it was going to play out? Were you kind of the view that, look, if I do the right thing here, if I tell the truth, I will be fine. You know what I mean? I will be, things will work out because that is what I should do. That is the right thing to do, is if I tell the truth, how could somebody possibly come back and criticize me or come after me? How did that conversation, like, what is as quick as that? Or was there a feel that, what, this could go sideways on me? You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Like this could spin out of control. And in this case, like if they're talking about indicting that other, like, again, to think that, for blowing the whistle, effectively, you could end up in jail. That just is completely wrong. But just how did was it a quick conversation, or was it like a 4 hour conversation where you were up all night with your wife and you finally decided at 6 a.m. Half an hour before you got to go into the office what you're going to do?
The conversation with my wife was relatively quick. But look, it weighed on me and it weighed on her too, because Jay Dobbins, who was an agent who infiltrated the Hells Angels in Phoenix, well, he lived in Tucson, but in the Phoenix Field Division, he blew the whistle on some misconduct that happened in ATF. And then later, his house burned to the ground, and command staff at Phoenix tried to blame Jay for committing the arson. So, I mean, I did not think it was going to go smoothly for me, but I didn't really see an alternative. And like, there was no way I could, if again, I didn't know what was going to happen with John Dodson. I knew Brian Terry was dead. I knew now at this point guns were walking. And then I knew something else too. Like, I had a team of agents that wanted to do their job, and in New York, look, I'm proud of some of the cases. Like, if you see behind me, I got plaques from all these cases I worked back in the day. That wasn't Pete. That wasn't me. That was a team. That was me working with prosecutors, me working with other agents. But you needed that like partnership with prosecutors to do that. Yep. So I had all these things I was proud of that I felt like I accomplished. And I watched my agents try and try and try and fail. Not because of them. Like, they were doing things right, but they could never get that buy-in. So I was like, wait a minute. Brian Terry's dead. They're talking about indicting John. The system here is badly, badly broken. Right? My agents, who are good people, deserve to enjoy what they're doing and deserve to be able to do the things that other agents in other parts of the country are doing. But unless this U.S. Attorney's Office does its job, they can't. And all of those things together it made it like I knew that I was going to have a rough road ahead. And I knew I was going to, my plan was just stick with the problem. Like, what I've seen a lot of whistleblowers do is they make it personal. It's me against the agency, or it's me against these people. I just wanted to highlight the problem. I actually liked some of the people that were on the other side of this. The main prosecutor, who unfortunately I blew the whistle on, was a friend.
Yeah.
But look, Brian Terry's dead. Friendships aside, they had a duty. And I didn't like doing this. It wasn't easy. I knew that the rough road was ahead, but I felt like I had to do it because it wasn't personal. It's like, you can't fix what you won't talk about. And we needed to talk about it. And the whole concept that we didn't walk guns, they were lying to the taxpayer. Like, when you take an oath to the Constitution and you swear you're going to do your job as a federal agent, you're swearing to the people of this country, not to the president, not to a cabinet secretary, not to some agency head. So you're only as good as your word. And I just felt like I had a duty to be true to mine.
And so you go in and you start the process. When did you realize that, like, this is going to start to go sideways for me, and maybe the good guys weren't the good guys anymore, and it was, this was starting to turn against me. When did you come across that sort of realization?
Oh, it was quick. Before there's a congressional hearing, there's a deposition. So I was deposed by the way it works in the United States. I know you have an international listenership. There's the Senate and Congress, and there's the Democrats and Republicans, right? So that, so they call it the four corners. So I got deposed by a team of congressional lawyers. They're not the Congress people. They're not the elected representatives. They're attorneys. They're investigators. From the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time was Patrick Leahy. So his staff, the staff from Charles Grassley, who was the ranking member, but he's Republican. And then on the Congress side, the chairman of the Oversight Committee was Darrell Issa, and the ranking member was Elijah Cummings, who's since passed. So their staff interviewed me, and it was about a 6 to 8 hour interview, and I laid everything on the table, everything, the grenade case, all the trafficking cases that were declined, the issues that we had, because you can't fix what you're not going to talk about. And plus, I wanted everything on the table because I didn't want it to look like I was holding anything back later on, because that was also not going to fare well for you. So anyway, the deposition ended, and I walked back to my car, which I parked at my office. The deposition happened in a conference room in a hotel, roughly 6 to 8 blocks, so not a very far walk. Before I made it to my car, my phone rings, and it was a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office who was a friend, who said, "Hey, Pete, I just need to warn you, everything that you said in that deposition was relayed to the United States Attorney, who was one of the decision makers in Fast and Furious, and my testimony was not going to be good for him." So I was like, okay, that's not good. Anyway, so again, I was assured when I gave my information to these staffers, everything you say in here is confidential. The government relies on whistleblowers to get stuff done. I later found out it was Senator Leahy's staff that called Dennis Burke, the U.S. attorney, and told him exactly what I said. So I was like, okay, that sucks. Anyway, a couple of days later, I get a call from another prosecutor from the same office. Again, because I had some friends there that wanted to do their job because their policies were also hurting people that went to the U.S. attorney's office wanting to be prosecutors, who were always told, no, take a soft stance on things. And so he's, Pete, can we meet for coffee? Sure. So met him at the Paradise Bakery in downtown Phoenix, and he slides an email across the table to me, and I pick it up and I read it, and I think I can say it verbatim, but I'm going to be close. Basically, from Dennis Burke, the United States attorney, who was the chief federal law enforcement officer for the state of Arizona, to his entire staff, and it said, anyone having contact with Pete Forcelli, even if it's seeing him having coffee with his family on the weekend, it will be reported to me through your chain of command immediately. So now I'm starting to realize that I have a target on my back, right? So then, as time would go on, I would find myself, seeing people following me from my house to work or elsewhere, which is unnerving. And sometimes it would be covert surveillance where, you wouldn't notice them until, you pull into a gas station, they're parked waiting for you. But there were times where it was overt, where it was like they wanted you to see them. And I think it was to rattle me up a little bit, to see what would happen, and then there were times I'd be out with my family and there would be two guys who'd walk in, sit down and just stare at us. So you're sitting there with your wife and kids and you're trying to eat dinner. And so my kids didn't know what was going on. They were young. My wife is like, hey, why are they staring at us? And then you're thinking to yourself, like, here I am, a former New York City cop. I'm a federal agent. I'm armed. Like, do I confront them? Then you're like, well, if I confront them and they're armed and they sense there's a threat, do they shoot me or do they kick the shit out of me? Like, you wonder, part of my language, you wonder, like, where's this going? So you just take the high road and like, hey, let's go and pay the bill. Sometimes before the food even arrived, and you leave. So that went on for a while. And then eventually I had to testify in front of the actual committee, which is different because this is the Congress people. So they're not really sometimes looking for answers. They're getting their talking points out. Some of them asked good questions. Most of it was like we were talking about before. We need more gun laws or we need less gun laws. And again, I'm just there to be an unbiased enforcer of the law. If you change the law, I'll enforce what's on the books. I don't have a dog in the fight other than to do my job. But anyway, so while I'm testifying in front of Congress, the chief of the criminal division, which is a high-ranking person in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Phoenix, was in ATF headquarters, where they had like a command post to monitor the testimony. Because again, I was also blowing the whistle on some of them too in ATF. He's like, Pete Forcelli's perjuring himself. He's lying. We never rejected these cases. So now I was basically had a call and have an investigation against me for perjury and a number of other things, which luckily everything that I testified to, I either had witnesses to or documents to prove. But I spent 4 years being investigated by the Department of Justice's Inspector General's office, by the Deputy Attorney General's office. And, so it was rough 4 years for me and my family, nearly bankrupted us, certainly made things stressful. We had to leave the state of Arizona, which cost us a couple $100,000 in the end. But yeah, in the end, it was just about, hey, at this point forward, I'm going to make it about the issue. I still didn't make it personal. And I made it about fixing the issue and just getting back to work, which took a while.
And what is your advice to a whistleblower, Pete? Like, man, oh man, you just talk about all that, being surveilled, lawyers' fees, taking every last dime and just the stress on you and your family. You certainly asked the question, is it all worth it? I think that's a fair question to ask because look, at the end of the day, there it comes at a cost. What's your advice to a whistleblower out there? It doesn't necessarily have to be a whistleblower at the ATF, or a whistleblower in any field, because I think, anybody who blows the whistle in the organization is going to take some degree of heat and going to deal with stress. Now, the stress you dealt with is far in excess of that, but still, it's a tough. The reason why whistleblowers are protected is because they're supposed to be protected is because it's a really tough thing to go through. What's your advice to a whistleblower?
Whistleblower laws, the laws are pretty much disregarded, frankly, by people in government. There were laws in place that they ignored. I was fortunate in that I tried to keep people who I knew were allies on my side. And again, I did that by not making it me versus ATF, or even me making it versus the Department of Justice, or even me making it versus the people that were involved in it. It's like, here's the problem. I want to fix the problem. Here's what I saw. And I stuck to that, only that. Where some of the other whistleblowers that I've seen, and even in this case, they made it personal, like me versus them. Like they hated the people involved in that case. I didn't respect what they did. They did things that were wrong. I called them out on it, but it was never personal. So I think if I was to give advice, it would be to, if you see something, first really think it through, because I think look, I survived, but it wasn't, and look, I'm blessed. I know plenty of other federal whistleblowers who I met through my attorney who were bankrupted, who lost their jobs, who were run out of their careers. So, I mean, even when you're doing it and you do it right, it's still risky, but you got to look yourself in the mirror. But if you do it, man, don't, because the other thing is the politicians try to pull you into their corner. I didn't want to do that. Like, this is the problem. It's not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. It's not red or blue. It's red, white, and blue. So stick with the facts. Don't become political. Don't make it you versus them. And the other thing is, like, I got right back to work. Like, I literally was out there doing what I could do, doing the best I could do at it, not letting this become a distraction. Because I wanted to still be viewed as a valuable employee. So I think that those would be the things. Don't get political. Don't make it you versus the agency or you versus people. And, still go there and give your best effort every day. And I survived because I had some friends who like there was one guy he came in and replaced the head of the Phoenix office when Bill Newell got removed. So I told him, look, I got subpoenaed. I'm going to talk. And, I know it's not going to be easy. And his response was, he handed me a coin that he had in his pocket, a St. Michael's Challenge coin, and said, hey, as long as you're telling the truth, I have your back. Run to the truth. And he did. Now, I never went running to him when I was getting retaliated against. I informed him of things because I didn't want him to get dragged into the fight either. But by having him as an ally, he gave me the space to fight for myself while still giving me some degree of top cover, if that makes any sense. But it was a rough ride for me. And more so for the family, because they didn't raise their hand and take an oath. They were just, unfortunately, along for a really ugly ride.
So maybe just talk a little bit about the book then, because again, I would highly encourage everybody to take a read of the book. Pete takes you through this whole story in a lot of more detail than we're ever going to get into a 90-minute discussion we have here. But maybe just talk a little bit about the book. Like, was the book to some degree trying to get stuff off your chest? Was it therapy and just trying to get it out there? What was, maybe just talk a little bit about the evolution of the book and trying to put some of this on paper for others to read as well.
No, sure. A couple things on that. Like, my last role in ATF was the head of training for the organization. And it's weird. Like, I would run into agents from other parts of the country because we'd bring in people to help us train on new hires or do other advanced training. And I would be asked quite frequently, like, hey, what really happened out there? Like, so we had agents that were employed by ATF that weren't in Phoenix who didn't really know what happened there. So they believed the narrative that they got in the media, which is either the Republican narrative or the Democrat narrative. So which was false, right? So, I mean, they didn't know. So I actually had said, why don't we put together some, because the military does this all the time. When something bad happens, they'll put together some training because there's this belief that if you know about history, you're not bound to repeat it. And every time I would suggest it, it would be like, no, we don't talk about Fast and Furious. And we meaning ATF or the Department of Justice. So it's like, so I would constantly be asked by agents who were with ATF during that time, people who got hired after, or even by new hires at the academy. So here's the fresh young faces coming into the profession, right? Some of them are just happy to have a job, so they don't know who I was. But every now and then you'd run into one who would like Google the history of ATF and see, wait a minute, whistleblower. First question was usually, hey, what are you still doing here? Like, how come you're not fired? But then they would even ask. And it was like constantly like, I would have small conversations a little bit, not like to the depth we're having here, because I just didn't have the time. Because I'm still working, but so it was to educate those folks as to what happened, so it doesn't get repeated again. And the reality is, some of the folks, as you read in that last chapter at the U.S. Attorney's Office, they were never held accountable. The lawyers were never pointed out. Some of the agents got fired, others got reassigned. Not everybody that deserved discipline got it. And then, so that was one main reason, to educate people. So it wasn't like, really catharsis, other than I just felt like a duty to inform people of what happened so it doesn't happen again. But then finally, I got to know Brian Terry's family a little bit through social media, and I got to meet them. I met Brian's mother. In fact, when I testified at the June 15th hearing, which if your listeners really care to watch it, it's on C-SPAN still. You can find it. Josephine Terry, his mom, sat at the far end of the table for me, and I met her, and I met his brother, and I've met his cousin, and I've had interaction with his sisters, and they're truly wonderful people, like nice people. And they lost Brian in the line of duty doing what he was supposed to be doing. And they obviously want him back, and they know they can't have him back. But the other thing they wanted was answers. And they were treated so disrespectfully and never given the answers by the government because the government was so busy covering their tails and pointing fingers at each other and making it political that I felt a duty to let them know what I knew, which isn't going to answer all of their questions, but it might give them some idea what led to Fast and Furious and what happened so that maybe they can get a little bit of peace out of it. And you know, truthfully, I've heard from his brother, who was incredibly grateful that I wrote the book for that reason, which to me makes it worth it. But yeah, those are my two reasons. And look, I'm not going to lie. Lost a ton of money paying lawyers' bills and travel fees back then. If I can make some of that back, that'd be great. But the reality is most books don't even break even. So yeah, that's more of a pipe dream than a reality at this point. But it's the first two reasons were my primary reasons.
And what's the feedback been? Has it been has the positive outweighed the negative? Because I can imagine there's some people inside of the government who are not too happy that you chose to go and put, and put it out and remind people. But I'm sure there's a bunch of others that are saying, thank you very much, Peter. We very much appreciate you getting the truth out there. What's the feedback been on the book so far?
It's been positive. And exactly like you said, like I haven't heard from the people who are on the other side of it. I don't know if they'll ever reach out to me. And I don't hate them. They messed up. I hope that they understand that this isn't personal. This is just so it doesn't happen again. There can't be another Brian Terry. There can't be all of these people dying on the other side of the Mexican border. Look, here's the thing. Guns and the hand grenades that John Baptiste King remade, they're not perishable, right? They are going to be there until they're found next to a body or in some search warrant. And that's not something that we can forget. So that's why we can't let another Fast and Furious happen. But for the folks that were never told what happened, that only heard the political versions, if they don't know what happened, it sure can happen again. So Look, read the book and see what happened, because it was basically folks abandoning the basic principles of law enforcement. It was nothing fancy. I mean, you read the book. They just abandoned the basics, and the end result was catastrophic.
And how should we all think about trust in government? Like how, you've been through the ringer over the last number of years going through all of this. How have your views on government and this ideology that, we have good guys and bad guys, and we have this nice line in between that we can all draw. How do you kind of reconcile all that now? Is it a lot blurry? Has it gotten a lot more gray in terms of the line between good and bad?
Yes and no. Look, I think most people enter government to do good. I think the problems I see, and again, going back to the book, is some folks are lazy. Like we had prosecutors there to for them to do their job would have been a lot of work. Okay, people in New York did it, but so you had that. Then you had people that were just so ambitious to promote, and this is a problem. That they would have said yes to anything. Like, there's a high profile case, I'm all in. Had they spent the time in their previous ranks moving up, to the next level, had they stopped and admired the view for a few minutes, right, and learned the job, they would have known better. So ambition in government is a dangerous thing. And I think that's really the threat. Like one of the things in Fast and Furious in the real story is a cautionary tale. Don't promote too fast without learning the job that you're in before you're looking to take that next, step up the ladder. Had folks done that, this might have never happened. They would have known better.
Yeah. So next steps for the book, I've drawn some comparables to 24, because I think it is a compelling read, frankly, from start to finish. I think, it would certainly make for a good season of 24. Any next steps for the book, Pete? Like, where do you think, does it go anywhere from here? Is it going to stop as a book, or do you think, it could be a documentary, it could be something else? What's next? What's next for you? Anything exciting coming down the pipe on the next steps for the book?
I've been spending a lot of my time just at this point, just speaking about 9/11 to, to groups out there about the importance of taking care of yourself and about the importance of taking care of family. The book's out there. Uh, the feedback has been good so far. Like folks that have read it seem to like it, and they seem to have learned something, which again, was the whole motivation for writing it.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, we'll see what happens. I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I know most books don't even make back the money that were put into writing them. So, and this is my first book. I'm an unknown author. So, I mean, who knows if maybe I'll get lucky. So, but we'll see.
Well, congratulations, Pete. It's again, I would highly recommend people take a read of it. Again, it's one thing if you're in the ATF and you're going to read the book, you're going to come away with a certain perspective. It's another thing if you're someone like me who knows nothing of this world, and to open up the book and go through it and learn about the world and how you can become disillusioned in terms of again the good guys and the bad guys and about how it actually works is totally different than maybe what you would see in movies and on the TV screen. So no, thank you. Thanks very much, Pete, for joining us today. Congratulations on the book, and I'm here. Netflix, give Pete a call. I think it would make a great great movie or doc. I'm in that camp. So
Oh,
congratulations, and
thank
we
you.
really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks. And thanks for having me. It means a lot to me. I
Uh,
appreciate it.
you're welcome.